April 12, 1945, 7:09 p.m. The cabinet room of the White House. The chandeliers cast a long, cold light across the mahogany table. Harry S. Truman stood with his right hand raised, a Bible resting beneath his left. Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone administered the oath of office in a grim, rushed murmur. Less than 2 hours earlier, Eleanor Roosevelt had informed Truman that her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had defined American power for 12 years, was dead from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. As Truman lowered his hand, he looked around the room. Standing in the shadows were the members of Roosevelt's cabinet, the Brain Trust, the architects of the New Deal, and the masters of the global war economy. They were looking at Truman, but they weren't seeing their new commander-in-chief. They were looking at a political accident, a former haberdasher from Missouri who didn't belong in the room. What the men in that room didn't know was that their patronizing grief was a fatal miscalculation. They believed they were the guardians of Roosevelt's legacy. They believed they would continue to run the United States government while treating the new president as a rubber stamp. They thought they held the power, but Harry Truman hadn't called them there to seek their guidance. Over the next 6 months, he was going to systematically dismantle Roosevelt's empire, firing the most powerful men in Washington one by one. It was a political bloodbath. To the Roosevelt loyalists, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. But Truman wasn't betraying the country. He was saving it from a ghost. To understand why Truman executed this ruthless purge, you have to understand the toxic, secretive fiefdom that Franklin Roosevelt had built. FDR was an aristocrat of power. He governed through chaos, deliberately pitting his cabinet members against each other so that he remained the sole arbiter of every dispute. He held the blueprints of the post-war world entirely in his own mind. He didn't share his plans with the State Department. He didn't share them with the military. And he certainly didn't share them with his vice president. During his 82 days as vice president, Truman had met privately with Roosevelt exactly twice. He was kept completely in the dark. He did not know about the Yalta agreements with Joseph Stalin. He did not know about the secret agreements to divide Europe. Most terrifyingly, he did not know about the Manhattan Project. It wasn't until after he was sworn in that the Secretary of War pulled him aside to explain that the United States possessed a weapon capable of destroying human civilization. Truman inherited the most destructive war in history completely blind, and the men who were supposed to be his guides, Roosevelt's inner circle, were actively trying to keep him that way. The core flaw of the Roosevelt cabinet was their religious devotion to a geopolitical strategy that was already dead. Roosevelt believed in the Grand Alliance. He believed that his personal charm had won over Joseph Stalin. He believed that if the United States treated the Soviet Union with trust and endless accommodation, Stalin would act like a gentleman in Eastern Europe. The men Roosevelt left behind, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, and Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace, were disciples of this accommodation. They were operating on the assumption that the Soviet Union was a partner in peace. But Truman wasn't a patrician dreamer. He was an artillery captain who understood raw power, and he was reading the raw intelligence. The reports crossing the Resolute desk were apocalyptic. The Red Army wasn't liberating Eastern Europe, they were swallowing it. Stalin was actively arresting democratic leaders in Poland. He was installing communist puppet regimes in Romania and Bulgaria at gunpoint. He was turning the Soviet occupation zone in Germany into a fortress. Truman realized instantly that the Grand Alliance was a suicide pact. The Soviet Union was not a partner. It was a totalitarian predator preparing to devour the ruins of Europe. But every time Truman tried to pivot the government toward a harder line, he hit a brick wall. His own cabinet was sabotaging him. They were slow-walking his directives. They were sending diplomatic cables that contradicted his orders. They were leaking stories to the press complaining that the new president was a warmonger, ruining FDR's vision of global harmony. Truman realized he could not fight a Cold War with a cabinet built for appeasement. The blueprint had to be burned. The purge began. The first casualty was the State Department. Edward Stettinius was the Secretary of State, but under Roosevelt, the title was meaningless. FDR had been his own Secretary of State, using Stettinius merely as a handsome figurehead to manage the paperwork, while Roosevelt made the real deals. Truman needed a heavyweight. He needed someone who could negotiate with the Soviets with brass knuckles. In June 1945, barely 2 months into his presidency, Truman forced Stettinius to resign. He replaced him with James Burns, a ruthless political operator. It was the first signal to the Roosevelt loyalists that their untouchable status was gone. But Burns was just the opening act. The real battle for the soul of the post-war world centered on the Treasury Department, and a man named Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau wasn't just a cabinet member. He had been Roosevelt's closest friend. He had run the Treasury since 1934. He considered himself the ultimate protector of the Roosevelt legacy. And Morgenthau had a plan for the defeated nation of Germany, a plan so brutal and vindictive that it threatened to hand all of Europe to Joseph Stalin. It was called the Morgenthau Plan. It dictated that post-war Germany should be completely deindustrialized. Morgenthau wanted to strip the country of every factory, every mine, and every piece of heavy machinery, turning Germany into a giant, impoverished agricultural pasture. Roosevelt had tentatively agreed to it before he died. Truman looked at the Morgenthau Plan and saw a geopolitical disaster. He understood the basic mechanics of European survival. If you destroyed Germany's economy, the German people would starve. If the German people starved, the rest of Europe, which relied on German coal and steel to rebuild, would also starve. And if Europe starved, the desperation would drive the entire continent straight into the arms of the Communist Party. Truman knew that poverty was the soil in which communism thrived. The Morgenthau Plan was essentially a Soviet recruitment drive paid for by the American taxpayer. In early July 1945, Truman was preparing to leave for the Potsdam Conference to meet Stalin face-to-face. Morgenthau marched into the Oval Office and demanded to be included in the delegation. He wanted to go to Germany to ensure his plan of destruction was implemented. He told Truman that his presence was essential to honor Roosevelt's wishes. Truman politely declined. Morgenthau, used to the endless indulgence of FDR, played his ultimate card. He issued an ultimatum to the President of the United States. He threatened to resign immediately if he wasn't allowed to go to Potsdam. He expected Truman to back down, beg him to stay, and validate his power. Truman looked at him coldly. He didn't hesitate. He reached across the desk, accepted the resignation on the spot, and told Morgenthau his services were no longer required. Morgenthau was stunned. The architect of the American war economy, the closest confidant of FDR, was escorted out of the administration before the summer was over. Truman had amputated the most powerful civilian in Washington to save the German economy. By killing the Morgenthau Plan, Truman laid the groundwork for the Marshall Plan, ensuring that Western Germany would become an economic bulwark against the Soviet Union, rather than a starving communist satellite. But the most dangerous threat to Truman's presidency wasn't in the Treasury. It was in the Department of Commerce. It was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the high priest of the Roosevelt left. He had been FDR's vice president from 1941 to 1945, before party bosses forced him off the ticket and replaced him with Truman. Wallace was a man of intense, almost mystical idealism. He believed with absolute religious fervor that the United States and the Soviet Union could coexist in perfect harmony. Wallace didn't just disagree with Truman's hardening stance against Stalin. He viewed it as a moral crime. While Truman was receiving classified briefings about Soviet espionage rings operating inside the United States, Wallace was publicly arguing that the U.S. should share its atomic bomb secrets with Moscow to build trust. For over a year, Truman tolerated Wallace because firing him would enrage the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. But Wallace mistook Truman's patience for weakness. He began operating as a shadow Secretary of State. He wrote letters to foreign leaders. He leaked memos to the press. He acted as if the presidency had been stolen from him, and he was determined to correct the error by destroying Truman's foreign policy from the inside. The breaking point came on September 12, 1946. The situation in Europe was on a knife's edge. Truman's actual Secretary of State was in Paris, engaged in tense, high-stakes negotiations with the Soviets over the future of the continent. The administration was trying to present a unified, impenetrable wall of American resolve. That night, Henry Wallace walked onto the stage at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Facing a massive crowd of left-wing supporters, the sitting Secretary of Commerce delivered a speech that effectively declared war on his own government. He told the crowd that the United States had no business interfering in Eastern Europe. He stated that the "get tough with Russia" policy was a path to World War III. He blamed American imperialism, not Soviet aggression, for the rising tensions. He gave the Soviet propaganda machine the greatest gift it could ask for, a former American vice president confirming every lie Stalin was telling about American aggression. The international backlash was instantaneous. European allies panicked, wondering who was actually running the United States. The Secretary of State sent an encrypted cable from Paris threatening to resign immediately if the president didn't put a stop to this insubordination. Truman was furious. He realized that holding the Democratic Party together was no longer worth the cost of American credibility. On September 20th, he summoned Wallace to the White House. He didn't ask for a compromise. He didn't ask for an apology. He demanded his resignation. When the news broke, the political establishment went into shock. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. The left wing of the party accused him of murdering Roosevelt's dream of peace. They branded him a warmonger. But with the firing of Henry Wallace, the purge was finally complete. In less than 18 months, Truman had erased the ghosts of the Roosevelt administration. He had removed the Secretary of State who was too weak, the Treasury Secretary who was too vindictive, and the Commerce Secretary who was too naive. He had cleared the room of the men who thought they were his masters. And in the empty space they left behind, Truman built the architecture of the modern world. Freed from the sycophants of the past, Truman surrounded himself with cold, brilliant realists. He brought in George C. Marshall, the military genius who would design the economic resurrection of Europe. He brought in Dean Acheson, the intellectual powerhouse who would help forge NATO. He listened to George Kennan, the diplomat who articulated the doctrine of containment. These men didn't operate on sentimental attachments to the Grand Alliance. They operated on the ruthless calculus of the Cold War. Together with Truman, they drafted the Truman Doctrine, explicitly committing the United States to stopping the spread of communism anywhere on the globe. They executed the Berlin airlift, staring down Stalin's blockade without blinking. They rebuilt Western Europe into an economic fortress that the Soviets could never penetrate. None of this would have been possible if Harry Truman had been a loyal team player. If he had kept Roosevelt's inner circle in power to honor the dead president's legacy, the history of the 20th century would have been written in Moscow. Henry Morgenthau would have starved Germany, handing the industrial heart of Europe to the Red Army. Henry Wallace would have handed over the secrets of the atomic bomb and pulled American troops back across the Atlantic. The United States would have retreated into isolationism, exactly as Stalin had calculated, leaving the Soviet Union as the undisputed master of the Eurasian landmass. The deep dive into Truman's first 2 years reveals a terrifying truth about the nature of executive power. We are taught to revere loyalty. We expect a smooth transition of power. We assume that the wisdom of a great leader like Franklin Roosevelt should be carried forward by his successors. But history does not care about loyalty. History only cares about reality. When Truman walked into the Oval Office, the reality of the world had violently shifted. The fascist threat had been replaced by the communist threat. The tactics that won the Second World War were the exact tactics that would lose the Cold War. Roosevelt's men couldn't see the shift because their egos were tied to the world they had already built. They were fighting the last war. Truman saw the new war, and he understood that to win it, he had to commit an act of profound political violence. The lesson of Truman's purge is about the terrible burden of leadership. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies a nation faces are not the foreign dictators across the ocean. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the well-intentioned, highly decorated experts sitting inside your own cabinet who refuse to admit that the world has changed. Harry Truman accepted the hatred of his own party. He accepted the accusations of betrayal. He allowed his own reputation to be dragged through the mud by the press. He did it because he recognized that true leadership requires the courage to stand alone. He erased Franklin Roosevelt's inner circle because he knew that you cannot govern the future if you are being held hostage by the architects of the past. In the end, the betrayal of Roosevelt's men wasn't a betrayal of the United States. It was the brutal, necessary exorcism that saved the free world. Truman walked into a room full of arrogant men who thought they could control him. He walked out of that room having established the geopolitical framework that would eventually tear down the Soviet Empire. And he proved that the ultimate measure of a president is not who he keeps by his side, but who he is willing to destroy to protect the nation.